Hello, this is Jon Hopwood, and I welcome you to another visit with Ward13. Tonight, my special guest is a good friend of mine, Michael Hammond. He was my roommate at the Defense Language Institute, where we studied Russian together. Mike, I think you were a little more successful in the Russian, weren't you?
Due to your inspiration, John.
Why don't you, Mike? Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Your background? Once again, you were at the Defense Language Institute. You studied Russian, and you were our best student, weren't you? Did you win
Well,
the
I wouldn't
award?
say I was the best student. Yes, John and I were studying together.
No,
I think,
no stories now.
yeah, okay, no,
I'm running
first,
for office.
but as for me, and probably John was similar. I always had an interest in Russia and Russian language and the culture. So
You studied for your master's degree at the University of Texas, didn't you?
no, actually, I didn't finish, so let's not bring that up.
But you were an officer. I was just a lowly sergeant.
Well, as you once reminded me, an officer in the reserves, which is not quite the same, but nevertheless, yeah, I took advantage of what the military had to offer me, and I'm still grateful for being able to study Russian and get paid for it, because actually, to study Russian in a private university
Would have been
or
quite
institute,
expensive.
it's quite expensive.
And there was only two at the time, Middlebury and MIS, the Monterey Institute of International Studies. There was only two Russian language schools because during the McCarthy period, remember, they kind of crushed the Russian language and culture studies. But let's just cut to you took after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you used your Russian skills. When did you go to Moscow?
I guess that was must have been 95. I had already started working in, like the high-tech industry, for Silicon Valley
Right, we were in
companies.
the Silicon Valley together too.
Yeah,
Remember Information Access Company.
But then I was working as a territory or sales manager for various high-tech companies. And I guess it was 94, the company I was working for, one of the guys in charge of the European operations says, "Hey, we're gonna open up an office in Moscow." And to make a long story short, I said, "Hey, listen, if you don't have anybody to do that, I'd love to do it."
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, I would go over to, and finally we agreed. And I thought, okay, I'll go over to Moscow for 2 or 3 years just to have the experience, because actually I'd always wanted to travel and live abroad, but never had the capability of doing that. So I took that job. One thing led to another. So here I am.
19 years
19 years later, 18 years
19
later.
years in the former Soviet Union. How long were you in Moscow? How long were you in Russia?
I was in Russia up until 4+ years ago, when I kind of relocated to Kiev.
Now,
Kiev,
why did you leave Moscow? Was it anti-American feeling? Did it make the business climate worse? Or why did you move to Kiev?
well, quite honestly, for quality of life, Kiev was just a much more pleasant city. But yeah, I've experienced a number of these periods where there's a pretty intense anti-American sentiment. I mean, the first one that I experienced was when during the Clinton era, we bombed Serbia.
Right. Which was an ally of pan-Slavism. Russia had gone to Serbia's aid in 1914.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was one of the causes of the First World War. Yes, this was a pretty stressful time, because up to that time, Russians viewed America and Americans very, very favorably.
Right.
And they were, to this day, unable to understand why we would take it upon ourselves to go in and bomb Serbia for the purpose of liberating Kosovo or something.
Now, did that help bring Putin to power, like the anti-American backlash?
Do you know there is? I recently read a Russian analyst saying that if we hadn't bombed Serbia,
Yeah.
then the chances of Putin never coming to power would have been a lot less.
What,
So yes, I've heard that.
what
That's
was it
very well understood.
like to live under Putin? I remember you telling me maybe 10 years ago when he was prosecuting the Chechnyan War, which was genocide. You know, that was a no holds barred, like the Eastern Front between the Nazis and the Red Army, that you weren't very enamored of the Chechnyan policies of Putin. Because Putin prosecuted the second Chechnyan War, right? The first was under Yeltsin.
Yes, and he criticized the way they ended the first Chechen war. You know, Russians get their news from TV, and so I always felt when Putin or the state media would begin to put out a message that was anti-American. I always hunkered down a little bit because you feel a bit defensive.
And it was coming from the Kremlin. Television's controlled by the Kremlin, right? Do they still call it the Kremlin?
It's very much controlled by the Kremlin. You know, it's changed over time. I mean, now they've taken pretty much 99% control over it. There were some independent stations and outlets which over time they have closed.
Yes.
By various methods. But I recall speaking of the Chechen war. You know, there was an incident which some folks may recall. I'm ashamed to say I can't remember exactly when, but in Beslan there was
the school massacre.
Yeah, right.
Where Chechnyan separatists,
Chechen separatists or radicals, held these kids hostage, in the school under horrific conditions. And I, like everyone else, was
Russian children, Russian ethnic children, yeah.
But after it was over, rather than having words of reconciliation, Putin on television said that Western foreign powers or intelligence operatives were behind it.
Because that resulted in the massacre of over 100 students, right?
Yes. Well, actually, especially when they were, so to speak, freed by the Russians, which is typically a brutal effort.
Now, can I just give you a point of view of Victoria, my friend from Russia, who I met? She lived in Pebble Beach. I met her 10 years ago. She was born in 1980. She hates Putin. She's now a U.S. citizen. But Russians have their own way of looking at the world, don't they? When she talked to me about Chechnya, she explained the Chechens just don't want to liberate Chechnya. They want to liberate the Caucasus, Dagestan, all of those things. They're imperialists themselves. And she pointed out that Tolstoy wrote a novel over 120 or 30 years ago about a warlord from that era. That these conflicts are very deep-rooted, aren't they, Mike? They go back centuries.
They are.
Yeah.
Your first point, I think, is it should be the foundation for our discussion, and that is that the Russians view the world and view events very differently from the way we do. Because of these historical reasons you're talking about.
It's not America. They were part of the Allies of World War II, but they have a different view of World War II. In fact, they call it the Great Patriotic War. World War II and the Great Patriotic War overlaps World War II. But we have to remember, Stalin and Hitler made a pact to dismember Poland. Without the Stalin-Hitler pact, Hitler wouldn't have felt free to invade Poland. And the Soviets took Eastern Poland at what was called the Curzon Line. They divvied up Poland, didn't they?
You mean the Ribbentrop Pact?
Oh, yeah, the Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact.
Yeah.
They see World War II differently as, like, say, the English and we, as the Allies. They see World War II quite differently. Just let me, I'm going to just say one more story with Victoria, and then I'll let you get a word in edgewise, which will be a record, right? Victoria called me up on May 8th, 2005. It might have been May 9th because I think they do it differently, maybe a day later, VE Day. And she was in tears, Mike. She was crying. This is a 25-year-old woman and saying, John, the sacrifices of our grandparents, and then remembering I'm 20 years older than her, and our parents. And you know, Big Hop was World War II vet, my uncles and everybody. But to her, she was in tears. That war, 50 years later, resonated with her, and she was born 35 years after the war. And to me as an American, even though my uncle Chester won a Silver Star and got wounded at the Battle of the Bulge, it just doesn't have that resonance, does it? World War II is very alive in their culture.
And that Victory Day celebration, which I happened to be in Moscow this year during that time, it's part of, not to denigrate the celebration of that event at all, but it's part of state and official propaganda. It has been forever.
Oh, really?
So it's very much a state event. You know, you have the posters everywhere. The TV programs are full of stories about it. You know, that's really part of the legitimization, or has been historically, of the Soviet or the communist regime.
Right, that was of the Soviet regime.
Because that was what Stalin brought us. You know, because up to that point, what had he really done? So that's their historical reference. That's our legitimate. That's what legitimizes us. You know, the Russian. You know, Putin has brought in and kind of furthered, or let's say absorbed a lot of that Soviet propaganda in his Greater Russia ideology or push. You know, to bring to make Russia great again.
But it also has there's a saying amongst, you know, that the Russians just are used to having a czar. I call Putin Tsar Putin. Now, as part of that, taking on the old generalissimo, you know, Joe Stalin, the style or the rhetoric, is that part of Putin actually solidifying his own regime as a czar? Because,
well, of course it is. But we have to keep in mind one thing: Russians, and I guess for a long time have felt threatened. You know, they have no, unlike the U.S., they don't have oceans separating them from their enemies. You know, it's just a great landmass, and so they've been invaded by, you know, the Mongols, the Germans, the French.
Yes.
So they are kind of what we would call paranoid. Yeah. So they think that, you know, we have these restless populations in the Caucasus, Chechens, and others. We have the West threatening us from, you know, Poland, and not to mention the U.S.
Well, they were invaded by Napoleon and Hitler. You know,
there are threats all around. The country itself could break up. Yeah. So only a strong hand can keep this all together.
That is part of their psyche. That's part of the Russian psyche.
And that explains why they are even looking for a guy like a Putin to come in with a hard hand, firm hand, take names, and keep, you know, they don't really mind. They would even expect him to steal a little bit, you know, or to enrich himself, but just keep things together, you know.
What was the effect of the breakup of the Soviet Union on the Russian psyche? You know, they had controlled Ukraine for over 250 years, you know, at least since 1750. Moscow, you know, the czars of Moscow, the Moscow Rus. What was the hit on their psyche? Like, what would be the equivalent if we lose Texas or California, if they were to hive off because of demographic change or something? What was the Russian attitude towards losing this great empire, probably the greatest physical empire that, except for the British Empire, that existed in history?
Well, of course, you're probably familiar with Putin's famous statement that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, so for Putin and for a lot of people, yeah, that was a tragic event, and yeah, the Russians felt a sense of loss for a long time. The truth is that all of these the stands and the southern republics,
Yeah.
Russians they would gladly do without them.
Even
But
with all their oil?
well, they're different. They're in many cases Muslim republics,
Right.
which
They
the average Russian wouldn't feel a lot of kinship with. But to lose Ukraine, that is that's something very, very different. And
Let me tell you, so I was in a neighborhood, the Lower East Side of New York, like 15 years ago, with another friend of Sovietologist, and I said, "Geez, they've misspelled the restaurant." And my friend says, "John, that's Ukrainian." Russian and Ukraine, the language is very similar, and ethnically, would it be like between like a Scot and an Irishman? Well. And there's also different Gaelic groups, like the Welsh, the Scots and the Irish are one group of Gaelics. And then like the Bretons and the Welsh are another group that's distinct because of their language. And, but they all look alike.
yeah, they're indistinguishable.
Ukrainian and Russian, how different are they?
Yeah, well,
how different's the language?
Kiev,
Yeah.
for example, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, where I am now and where I've lived for the past 4 years or so. In fact, on the street, you will hear Russian 75, 80% of the time. This is a bilingual city.
Yes.
People understand and can speak Russian, Ukrainian, but it's not like in the western part of Ukrainian, Lvov and those places
Right.
where Ukrainian is the absolute dominant language.
And are they mutually understandable? Or
I understand Russian quite well. I can pick up maybe 25, 50% of the Ukrainian is spoken. So I would without studying Ukrainian, I would be unable to understand it and speak it fluently. It's quite different. The intonations are all the same.
Okay, now we're being technical. We're going to bore people, but they are close. They're close.
They're very close.
Related
they're
people.
Close. The Ukrainian is kind of similar to the Belarusian language.
Right.
A lot of Ukrainians claim that Ukrainian language is closer to the old Slavic language than is Russian. And let's keep in mind, the Russian was, at least the alphabet and the written language was reformed, so to speak, by the communists.
What about the religion? Does the Ukrainian have its own church?
Okay, that's important because Kiev and this central area of Ukraine is Russian Orthodox, but in the western part of Ukraine, they have what's called the Greek Catholics, which is the Greek Catholics. Yeah, one of the popes made a deal with the Western Ukrainian rulers. Okay, listen, you keep your Orthodox liturgy and traditions, but you become subordinate to the Roman Catholic Church, and they're called Greek Catholics. So there are a lot of those in Western Ukraine, and the Russian Orthodox Church and many Orthodox believers view them as an enemy. They view them as kind of apostates. So there aren't, when we get into the conversation or the discussion of the differences, cultural differences, whatever, between Western and Eastern Ukraine, that's one of them. A religious difference, although I'm certain there are plenty of traditional Orthodox believers in Western Ukraine as well.
Let's go to the attitude of Ukrainians towards Russians and Moscow. What do Ukrainians now? After speaking to you, I realize there's different Ukrainians now: Western Ukrainians, Eastern Ukrainians, and these Greek Catholics. What is the attitude of your Ukrainian in the West and the East towards Moscow and Putin?
Okay, good question. Russia and Putin are, considerably more favorably viewed in eastern Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that borders Russia, than in western Ukraine. However, given all the troubles lately with the annexation of Crimea and Russia stirring up some of the trouble in eastern Ukraine, Russia by Ukrainians on the whole is viewed much less favorably nowadays than it was even a year ago. 1 year ago, I saw a poll recently that showed a significant drop in the popularity of Russia and Russians, perhaps.
But getting to the Crimea, the Crimea was part of Russia for since the Crimean War, and Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, for some reason gave the Crimea to Ukraine, which, in the fiction of the Soviet Union, there were, how many seats did they have in the UN? They had Russia, Ukraine, I think Belarus. They had at least 4 or 5 seats. He gave Crimea to Ukraine for whatever reason, we don't know. Maybe it was the 100th anniversary of the Crimean War, but maybe he was drunk or something. So Crimea, is it Ukrainian? Was it ever Ukrainian?
Well, there's, of course,
there's a sticking point.
That's a hot topic here in Kiev and Ukraine because they feel like it's theirs. However, it's a difficult historical claim.
So 60 years gives them. Well, they were guaranteed the integrity of their country if they surrendered their nuclear weapons, weren't they?
Yeah.
So they believe they're betrayed.
Yeah. Well, that. Was it the Budapest Agreement? Yeah, we didn't. No one was willing to stand up to Putin's annexation of Crimea. And in all fairness, first of all, that's not the way to conduct world. I mean, that's a very dangerous way to conduct policy in the world these days, just by going in and forcefully annexing a piece of territory from another country. I think that the West overall would have swallowed hard and kind of turned the other eye, turn their eyes away from that, given Russia's historical claim on Crimea, if they had stopped there.
But they
Russia
didn't stop.
And Putin didn't stop there. They said, hey, listen, we in addition to this, we're going to destabilize eastern Ukraine, mainland Ukraine.
Let's be frank. This is Putin. This is like Putin in Georgia 10 years ago, promoting a breakaway public to pressure the non-Russian oil pipeline, if we get down to it. But what was going on in Georgia? This isn't separatists just on their lonesome, is it? This isn't just like a bunch of high-spirited rebels down in South Carolina in late 1860, declaring independence. This is Putin.
No, it's not. It's not at all. We have to be honest and say that many people in the East don't like or don't really approve of rule from Kiev, especially with the current makeup of the government. But they weren't asking to be part of Russia. But Russia saw the opening. The people there are Russian speaking, and many of them kind of pine for the old stability of the Soviet Union when all their factories and their coal mines were operating at full capacity, which they no longer are. So the time was kind of ripe, and for the Kremlin to act there, especially after they ramped up their political propaganda machine, making the people in the West fearful that these radicals making the people in the eastern Ukraine, fearful that the radicals from Kiev and western Ukraine were going to come in and push them around and threaten them or even kill them. So there's some pretty brutal. In the East, probably more people watch Russian television than Ukrainian television.
Really?
So it was a pretty easy propaganda game for Russia to play there.
Now
let
me ask you a question. What is the per capita income of Ukraine compared to the per capita income of Russia? Isn't Ukraine a basket case? One of the. It's not very well off financially.
It's poor, and it's been misgoverned for a long time. They don't have the oil and gas revenue income that Russia has.
They don't have oil or gas. They're just. What is it? Is it an agricultural country mostly?
Well, agricultural. That eastern part of the country where all the problems are going on now is traditionally very highly industrialized.
Really?
And lots of resources were put into that area of the country. After World War II, it was kind of like going to be. I mean, there are huge steel factories and iron ores and all kinds of
right.
big industrial concerns and big coal mines in the east.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The agricultural part of Ukraine is really in different areas. The central and southern part of the country. But the country on the whole, you'd have to, by our standards, of course, is poor. And pensions here would maybe be equal to $100. And I think you could even say less than that now because the currency has been devalued by 50% over the past 6 months. So pensioners and public employees, teachers, they just can barely get by. Of course, in a cosmopolitan city like Kiev, there are a lot of well-off people. There's a pretty big, if in the U.S. we have a discussion about income inequality,
right?
Then here it's many times worse than anything that we can imagine back home.
Okay,
so
Mike,
the gap between rich and poor is really large.
We're getting towards the end of the first half hour. We're going to have a second half hour for next week, and we're going to talk about Ukraine, and we're going to focus on Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine that makes it so unique. We're not going to be talking about Russia. We're going to be talking about Ukraine itself and the tensions between the East and the West, and a particular figure from Ukrainian history who's quite controversial.
Yes.
That I only found out about that this morning when you called me. You imagine that he hasn't really been focused on in the Western media. But you hang on. We're going to do a second half hour. Get a drink of water or something, and I'd say comb your hair, man. Go look in the mirror. I see myself. I got to suck in my gut here. So we're going to be back in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.